This will be our first of two lectures about Congress. And to start off with, I'm just going to want you to understand where these lectures fit in. This list, we're not going to go through it in the lecture. It is what you need to know about Congress and where will you learn it, or maybe where you have already learned it. What I will point out about the list, not that you guys can't read and comprehend this, the key point of having it not only is, again, not to know just what you need to know, but where you're going to find and learn that information. And so in this list, pay attention to things that are broken down by where you're going to learn them: textbook, case briefs, constitution, iCivics assignments, or of course lecture. Items that are marked with an asterisk are going to be things that those of you preparing for the AP exam should pay special attention to. But of course, even for those of you taking it as honors or dual credit, what's important for AP is also going to be important for us. Of course, the starting point for learning is, what is Congress? How is it organized? How is it led? You need to know about the powers of Congress and where they can be found in terms of constitution, case law, etc. How Congress legislates, some of its other functions over non-legislative tasks. I will say, as you're looking at this, going through the list, anytime you see a reference to how things have changed over time, whether it's the power of the speaker, the seniority rule, and power of committee chairs, those are going to be things you certainly need to include in your notes. They're easy to overlook. That's why I have noted this here. And those are going to be important details for you to include. Also, who are representatives and senators? And be careful with this. It's not that I expect you to talk about specific real-world representatives and senators, past or present. It is more kind of in terms of profile of what do representatives and senators look like, what are their characteristics, where things are going to come in lecture. You'd really be starting about here in terms of the other non-legislative tasks, and some bits about legislating process. Lecture notes are going to continue. They will be your source for information about congressional elections and their consequences. Same thing with apportionment and what influences members' decisions in Congress, particularly here in terms of thinking about support for legislation or opposition to legislation. So let's get into the topics that will be covered by lecture. And within this, again, you've learned the basics of the legislative process already. We're going to be focusing on some special topics related to that process. So again, what have you already learned? The structures of Congress, the chambers, committees and such, components, leadership positions, right, including people in Congress, right, those profiles of what members of Congress look like. You've learned the basics of the legislative process. I would certainly focus your review of that on the flow chart. Visualizing that process is the best way to learn it, rather than a list of steps. The special features we're going to learn about several different things that can block the progress of a bill through the legislative process. Include pigeonholes, filibusters. We'll also look at things that help a bill pass along the process of becoming a law. Something called cloture, and we'll also talk about something that you might think of as part of unorthodox lawmaking, and it certainly can be, but it's also not a new development, and that is riders. So again, taking this in order, In terms of things that block a bill's progress, um, first, it's something that goes way back, and its name will help us understand that. Pigeonholes are really what happens to most bills. And when a bill is pigeonholed, it is simply set aside to be just lost in the shuffle of other bills and forgotten about. And the reason I say that this goes way back and that it's tied to its name is pigeonholes refer to these spaces in old desks where it would be really easy to set a piece of paper, uh, let it get buried behind others, and be lost and forgotten about. And that is what happens to most bills because most bills really don't need to be passed. A lot of them are things that a representative might create as a bill and file as a bill solely for the purpose of satisfying some constituent or interest group. They can say that they take action on it. They wrote a bill about this issue or this thing that somebody or some organization wanted, and then, darn the bad luck, nobody else in the committee was interested in it. Nothing could be done, and the bill is dead. Right? But the member of Congress can still say that they tried. Filibusters are also old. We'll spend some time learning about these in a supplemental assignment. But for now, what we need to understand is the filibuster is something that can happen only in the Senate. And that is because the Senate has the reputation as, quote, the greatest deliberative body on earth. And that reputation comes from its tradition of having debate that is not limited by time. In the House, there are rules that strictly limit debate. Remember, a bill must go through the Rules Committee before going for floor debate, and a big part of the Rules Committee's work is to assign the rules for how that bill can be debated. How much time is there going to be to debate it? Can members offer amendments on the floor? So in other words, can members try to change the bill in the process of debate, or can the bill be debated for or against but not changed? But all of this is meant to kind of streamline as much as possible the process for debating and voting on a bill that has come out of committee and gone to the floor for debate. And so you will see, if you ever watch video or maybe live debate on the floor of the House, you will often see a representative kind of pass the speaking privilege to another member of the Congress, and they might say, I yield the remainder of my time, because time is being kept track of to limit how much time is spent on debate. The Senate does not have that. The Senate has unlimited debate. Members of the Senate can talk about a bill as long as they would like. And as a result of this, they can use the filibuster to talk a bill to death. Right? The idea here is that you simply block the Senate from taking action on anything else by tying up all of its time debating a single bill. And the goal of someone attempting a filibuster is to cause the rest of the Senate to lose patience and stop trying to pass the bill to move on to other business. This is something that has changed over time. And remember, when we talk about something changing over time, that is important for you to pay attention to. In the past, for a member to filibuster a bill, they actually had to remain on the floor of the Senate to maintain their recognition as the speaker and to continue talking about a bill. Again, the way filibuster used to work was that you stopped all other floor debate, all other progress of the Senate in terms of passing that bill or any other bills, in the hopes that the Senate would give up and move on to other things, and you could kill that bill you didn't like. Today, things work very differently. A senator can essentially filibuster by threatening to filibuster. They can just let it be known that they plan to filibuster a bill. And that tends to stop everything on that bill, and the Senate can go about its other business. So it's become much easier to filibuster. You don't actually have to stand there on the floor, and some of these have gone on for hours and hours and hours, which was difficult for senators to do. In the supplemental assignment you'll have about filibusters, you'll see some about the extraordinary case of Strom Thurmond's filibuster, right, and some of the strange details that go into that story. It's now no longer difficult for a Senate to have the effect of a filibuster because they only have to threaten it. And part of this, I know, will sound counterintuitive, but what makes this new style of or method of filibustering so effective is that it does not stop the Senate from doing other things. And because the Senate can continue with its other work, if you want to filibuster, you're not holding up the whole chamber. You are just stopping that bill, because everybody knows that if they do try to proceed to floor debate, you are likely to actually go through with a good old-fashioned filibuster and hold the floor and burn up the time of the Senate. But because now you can just threaten and other progress can be made on other bills, it's more likely that nobody's going to challenge your threat to filibuster. That bill will just be stopped in its tracks. And the upshot of this is that in the current Senate, more bills are blocked by filibuster, even though actual filibustering on the floor is less common. Now, those are, of course, the two key ways that a bill is blocked: the pigeonhole and the filibuster. And pigeonholing, I should point out, that happens in both houses. And the filibuster, again, is unique to the Senate. There are things that will help a bill get through the process. And one of these, just as we had the filibuster is only for the Senate, the discharge position is only for the House. And what this does is it forces a committee to report on a bill. And remember, when they report on a bill, right, the bill is coming out of committee to go to the Rules Committee and then to be sent to the floor for debate. Any representative can file a discharge petition. It doesn't matter if they're on the committee that is holding up a bill or not. Right? If they want that bill to come out for full consideration of the House and a floor debate, and then for a vote by the whole House, they can file a discharge petition. And remember, these are important because, well, they were especially important in the past. Remember, in the past, where the seniority rule made committee chairs incredibly powerful, they could just sit on bills they didn't like and keep them from going to the floor. Discharge petition allowed people to get around that. And of course, even those committee chairs have become less powerful and the seniority rule is not as ironclad as it used to be, there are still times when a committee will hold up a bill that other representatives outside of that committee want to get to the floor. Once a discharge petition has been filed, it requires a majority vote to force that bill out of committee. But if that is done, right, then that bill can move on. Another thing, I guess in terms of the pork barrel idea here, greasing the skids of a bill, or greasing the skids to help a bill slide along the process could be useful imagery here. Whether we're talking about riders or specifically about earmarks and pork barrels, we are talking about methods of gaining more members' support for a bill. And riders, earmarks, pork barrels, these are not things that are unique to the House. That was the discharge petition only. Riders are things that members of either house would like to tack onto a bill because it's something, some provision that they would like to see passed, but is either too insignificant or too unpopular to be able to pass as its own standalone bill. So we attach those riders to bills that other people want to pass. That can gain some support for maybe the niche group of representatives or senators that want that amendment. But even if they're only signing on to support a bill because of those riders, they're still signing on to support a bill, and that can help it move through the process. In that same category, right, we have earmarks, which are a specific type of rider. Earmarks refer to money for some specific thing, usually a specific project, often within a single state or congressional district. that are added onto a bill, again, to get support. You want a representative to support your bill, well, add in some money for maybe building a museum. And sometimes some of the stories that make the news critical of earmarks or that are brought to the attention of the American public by a representative or senator will highlight some of the very strange projects like museums for some specific and obscure interest. I think some of them have had to do with like museums for like crustaceans, and I don't believe I'm making that up. I mean, really specific things like that. But they win the support of that particular member of Congress, and that can help a bill pass. Because these earmarks are for money for a specific purpose to benefit a particular representative or senator, they're often referred to as pork or pork barrels. The idea being here that a member is able to bring home the bacon to their district or their, if we're talking about a senator, to their state. Now, as I said, sometimes these are highlighted in the media or by particular representatives or senators, and that has made them unpopular. And they were banned for about a decade in 2011, but they came back in 2021. And some of that has to do with a specific individual. Senator John McCain of Arizona was one of those members of the Congress who spoke out quite publicly and vociferously against pork barrel spending, right, and the earmarks. And that helped drive the ban. Of course, now Senator McCain is deceased, and pork barrel spending and earmarks are back. I guess we should talk there to play devil's advocate for earmarks, and that may even be putting it too strongly. Earmarks had been popular for a reason. They were a way for members of Congress to bring federal resources to their districts or their states. And remember, members of Congress are there to represent their constituents, and so bringing back spending to their particular district or state could be something that someone might criticize, but it could also be seen as a valuable way to return federal resources. Remember, constituents pay federal taxes, and so bringing some of those federal dollars back to their district or state could be justified in that sense. Continuing on to other things that help a bill pass, one of the things that has been highlighted, and I know this initially showed up in a 1997 book, but of course has continued to be relevant and has evolved, is something called unorthodox lawmaking. And this is a result of a process that really started to show up in the 1980s, where there was more partisan gridlock in the legislature. In response to this gridlock, leaders of both houses responded with certain strategies to get around that gridlock or break through that gridlock. And one was to assign a single bill to multiple committees, which, and as you've learned about it to this point, you would imagine that a bill is written, it is introduced and assigned a number, and it is then sent to a specific committee that is most relevant to that bill. Well, what leaders started to do in response to gridlock was assigning a single bill to multiple committees to work on. And then the leaders would act as the go-betweens to negotiate the bill, different elements of it between the committees. And that allowed, essentially what the leader is doing by sending the bill to so many committees is giving themselves as leaders, whether we're talking about the speaker or in the Senate, the majority leader, more power over that bill's fate. And in some cases, chamber leaders will also make their own revisions to a bill after it has come out of committee. So again, all of this is, for this part, is about the leaders taking a more active role in the fate of a bill. right, to ensure that it is able to get through the gridlock. In some cases, they might actually and have actually bypassed the committee process altogether, and they just take a bill and work to get it directly to the floor. Also, one of the things you've learned about to this point in the legislative process is the conference committee, where the Senate and the House have passed their own versions of the same bill, and then they need to have a conference committee to negotiate different to create a single bill that will be voted on in both chambers. Leaders have also started working directly with each other to negotiate the details of a bill before it has passed either house. So they're kind of, it's not a conference committee, it is just a conference between the leaders trying to make sure that we don't have differences in the bills to iron out in both houses. Again, the point of that is to avoid the conference committee process. Another thing leaders have done, and this is highlighted by multiple asterisks because it is very important, the rise of the omnibus bill. This is where multiple legislative topics, policy issues that aren't closely related to each other, are all thrown together in one giant omnibus bill. And you can kind of see in the political cartoons how these are characterized. They are massive bills, and in this cartoon they're seen as a way that leaders can kind of crush, right, the other members of the House and the Senate under the weight of, a giant bill that nobody has read through in its entirety. And that was something that was kind of famously seen in terms of the language, at least, in the passing of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, where the speaker at the time, Nancy Pelosi, famously said, you have to pass the bill to see what's in it. And kind of the meaning of that language is that you either get all of it or you get none of it. And the purpose of that is to force the majority to support the bill. You get nothing of what you want unless you get everything. And that kind of plays into this second political cartoon, where you're able to get past partisan gridlock. Of course, if you're not familiar with the imagery, the elephant represents the Republicans, the donkey represents Democrats, and the idea here is that they can get together because, well, they've made sure that there's something in the bill for everybody, but you can't get any of that unless you pass all of it in the omnibus bill. That is important to understand, that as important as the omnibus bill has become in a strategy for passing legislation, it is still susceptible or vulnerable to being filibustered in the Senate. That remains the unique and powerful tool of senators to block legislation, even if it is some huge and therefore important omnibus bill. Another strategy, and this can help you understand that one of the reasons Congress is so difficult, and from a student's perspective, tedious thing to learn about, is the importance of rules in the operation of the legislating process. Sometimes these tools allow for loopholes or workarounds for creative House and Senate leaders to use, and one of those is rules regarding budget reconciliation. If something has to do with budgeting and the need to reconcile different budgeting bills between the two houses, because of the provisions of the rules in those chambers, budget reconciliation gets around the filibuster. Things are worked out between the two houses, and regardless of the House. So in this case, we have an exception to the Senate's tradition of unlimited debate. In a budget reconciliation bill, debate time in both houses is limited because there's the assumption that they're just reconciling differences in fiscal legislation, and therefore don't need and don't have the full time for normal debate, which is, of course, the rules of the House always limit debate time, but in this case, the key is to kind of stymie the filibuster with limited debate time. Continued, as you can see, we only have a couple of things that will hold up a bill: pigeonholing and the filibuster. Of course, we can also see in that gridlock as that can play in, but especially that's important. Is something that encourages filibusters. And in that regard, we need to talk about some things that are unique to the Senate. The filibuster can be broken by a cloture vote. And now, cloture requires a supermajority, that is 60 votes to end debate on a bill. And that's difficult to achieve. The Senate has, especially in recent decades, been very evenly divided between the Republican and Democrat caucuses. And I say caucuses because remember, we often have in the Senate one or two independents, and those independents have almost always caucused with Democrats. But even when independents are joining with Democrats, it's hard for one party or the other to cobble together 60 votes to end debate. This is especially true in the era where not an actual filibuster, but only a threat of filibuster is sufficient to block a bill's progress. Because cloture is difficult, because it is becoming increasingly difficult in the new era where filibustering is easier, there's been something discussed as the nuclear option. And that is bringing about a rule change in the Senate where cloture no longer requires 60 votes. A vote by a simple majority, 50 senators plus one, is enough to end a debate. It has been used, as you can see in these political cartoons. This was something that the idea of blocking or of ending debate is not new. In this old political cartoon, when civil rights bills were being held up by filibusters, most famously by Southern senators like Strom Thurmond, the cloture vote was important. Here, right, we see the nuclear option, and these representing Senate leaders. Senator Harry Reid, former Senator Harry Reid, looking like soon-to-be former Senate leader Mitch McConnell, who has recently announced he will not stand for re-election. People watching this video in future, McConnell may already be out of the Senate. But the point here is that the nuclear option blows up the filibuster, and you can see here one of the limited ways the nuclear option has been used. I do want to be clear, to the extent that the rule change has been put into effect, it has not been an across-the-board rule change to end the cloture requirement of 60 votes to halt debate. It has been limited to some presidential nominees, as you can see in this political cartoon, cabinet nominees, but also federal judicial nominees. Which means, if we're talking about nominees, we're not really talking about helping legislation pass. So when we think about the nuclear option in terms of the legislating process, we need to understand that we're really not there yet. But as gridlock continues, don't be surprised if in the future, in some heightened circumstances, that the nuclear option is also applied to legislation, and the Senate's tradition of unlimited debate is further constrained. We're going to move on now to non-legislative tasks of Congress. So kind of a bit of an abrupt shift here. Legislation is, of course, the primary function of Congress, but it is not the only function of Congress. As we've seen before when we learned about Madison's system of separation of powers and checks and balances, the Senate's role in advice and consent is very important. Now, we really didn't see it in terms of the phrase advice and consent. That applies to some different things. One of those is the approval of presidential nominees for cabinet posts for the federal judiciary. Advice and consent for nominees requires only a simple majority of senators to support. Advice and consent is also relevant to ratifying treaties. Presidents get to negotiate treaties. We'll see that when we learn more about the executive branch in our next unit. But for a treaty to go into effect, it must be ratified by the Senate, and that has a much higher bar. You need 2/3 supermajority to ratify a treaty. And the reason for that higher bar is treaty law, treaty obligations of the United States. of trump all of our other laws, um, including things that would be perhaps found in the Constitution. And so ratifying treaties requires a much higher bar of advice and consent. Our next non-legislative task also gets into that issue of legislative checks on the executive branch. And here we're talking about in the extreme, the impeachment process. So be careful with the impeachment process because the term impeachment process can be a little misleading, but it is what you will always see talked about in the news if there is impeachment. And in your lifetime, and certainly in mine, impeachment has been something that has been much more frequently in the news. We have had 2 impeached presidents in recent years. Bill Clinton impeached, Donald Trump impeached twice. But the process has 2 steps. Now, ultimately, if it is successful, it can remove the executive, and it can also remove judicial officials, such as Supreme Court justices. The reason I say you need to be careful with the impeachment process is impeachment means something very specific. To impeach an executive official, and again, as the examples we've had from the real world, impeaching presidents of the United States, impeaching just refers to charging an official with a removable offense. And for that, the House has responsibility for impeaching or charging that official. And to impeach an official, all that's required in the House is a simple majority vote, which is why we have had 3 impeachments in recent years. Clinton once and Donald Trump twice. And that's as of the end of Donald Trump's first term, and not talking about the second term. The Senate is responsible for then trying the impeached official. Okay, so the Senate does not impeach. The House impeaches and the Senate tries. And the result of that trial can be a conviction or an acquittal. And here we're talking about political consequences. So conviction by the Senate does not mean that a president or a Supreme Court justice or a federal judge would be fined or imprisoned, but it does mean they would be removed from office. And conviction has a much higher bar, right? Kind of as we see with approval of nominees versus ratifying of treaties. It only takes a simple majority to impeach, but it requires a 2/3 supermajority in the Senate to convict an official who has been impeached. And for that reason, we have not had any impeached president in those examples we've used being convicted and removed from office. If the trial does happen, it is like a trial. There is a judge presiding over the process, and that is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. To help you remember the different steps and the different involvement of the 2 houses, there's an alphabetical order rule that helps with this. And that is HIST. If you have anything out of order, right, you need to stop and rethink the process. The House impeaches, the Senate tries. HIST. It all has to line up. And nicely, the letters are even directly after each other in terms of the alphabet. I comes directly after H, T after S. Don't mean to turn this into an episode of Sesame Street, but that means of remembering the impeachment process has been helpful to quite a few of my students in the past. Next up is the amendment process, which is something we've not seen since we first learned about the Constitution. Okay, to propose amendments, both houses have to support proposal of the amendment by 2/3 supermajorities. Now, that's only proposing. Ratifying an amendment is something that has to go to the states, either state conventions, which has only happened in the case of the 21st Amendment. Otherwise, it needs to be 2/3 of the legislatures of all of the states. Or sorry, not 2/3, 3/4. All right, so just to clarify that, since I didn't do it correctly the first time, so proposal, right, 2/3 supermajorities in both houses. Ratification requires 3/4 of conventions in the states, or the votes of 3/4 of the legislatures of the states. Continuing this terms of non-legislative tasks, I know this is kind of a grab bag of things. There are also important electoral powers of Congress. One applies only to the House. As a result of the 12th Amendment, the House can have responsibility for electing the president under kind of extraordinary circumstances, and that would be in case of a tie in the Electoral College, which has happened. For your AP US history, I can't remember if the course goes back that far, but the election of John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson is a case where the 12th Amendment has come into play. If this should happen again, how it would work, all of the House membership would be organized in terms of their state delegations. And of course, we have 50 different state delegations. Now, in the case of electing the president, the population of the states doesn't matter, right? Each state gets one vote for president of the United States. And all it takes is a simple majority to win. Much like the Electoral College, if a vice president needs to be elected, again, this would be also part of the 12th Amendment, same story, right? In case of an Electoral College tie, this would come into play. In this case, the senators do not vote by state delegation, but they vote as individuals. But, right, returning to the theme we saw in the election of the president in the House, this requires a simple majority to win. And now, if you're wondering why the lower house gets to pick the president in this case, and the Senate only gets to pick the vice president, even though it's the upper house, think back here to the design of the Constitution. The House was meant to be more directly responsible to the people. And so if there's going to be a tie in terms of the Electoral College, the House that is closer to the people, it is the House that gets to pick the president. We see that same kind of thinking, that same logic in terms of presidential succession, which we'll learn more about. But to give you a bit of a spoiler on that, if for some reason the president and vice president should both be unable, either because of death or incapacity, to serve as president, the next person in line to assume the presidential power is the Speaker of the House. In more recent history, Congress has had a part to play if there is a vacancy in the office of vice president. And I'd say more recently, we have the 12th Amendment for picking a president or vice president, but the need to fill a vice presidential vacancy was something that was dealt with much later in the 25th Amendment. And this is something that happened during the Nixon administration. Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign due to scandal. And all of a sudden now we have something that we needed to deal with, an absence in the vice presidency. The 25th Amendment says that the president gets to nominate a replacement vice president. And then that nominee has to be approved by a simple majority, only a simple majority, but in both houses. And so this is how Gerald Ford became vice president, which, so for a bit of your American political history trivia, Gerald Ford is the only president never to have been elected as vice president or president. He was nominated by Nixon to be vice president when Nixon resigned as a result of the Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford became president of the United States and served out the remainder of that term, and then lost in his re-election bid against Jimmy Carter. And that's where we're going to stop. We'll pick up in the next lecture talking about congressional elections.